Welcome to r/NuclearRevenge. Entitled Engineer Makes a Mistake He Will Regret the Rest of His Life. This is a story that I thankfully didn't witness, but my co-worker did. An engineer relocated with his wife to a small town while he supervised a local engineering project. He had 3 daughters who lived in the neighboring city and would visit him constantly. While he wasn't exactly rich, he was considerably wealthier than the average habitant of this little town. This made him and his wife extremely entitled. He would do as he pleased and then bribe the police to avoid repercussions. He made himself infamous for cheating on his wife constantly. One day, he laid his eyes on a local 18-year-old girl. The girl didn't like him back, so she rejected him. One day, he got drunk and raped the poor girl. He hurt her so bad, the girl was left in a wheelchair for life. The girl's father tried to bring him to justice, but the engineer used whatever money he had to bribe the police. What not many people knew is that the girl's uncle was a local drug lord. The father and the uncle hadn't spoken for years and the girl hadn't even met her uncle, but when the drug lord learned what happened to his niece, he decided he would have his revenge. A few weeks later, my co-worker was working as a gardener for the engineer when the cries of young women caught everyone's attention. Outside the engineer's house were the drug lord's men, who had captured the engineer's daughters. In front of the engineer and his wife, the men used machetes to cut the daughters' legs. There was blood everywhere, but the worst was the cries of the 3 women. They were rushed to the hospital, but 2 of them bled to death on the way, while the 3rd one was left, obviously, wheelchair bound for life. While my co-worker has since left his town, he says people told him the engineer's wife hasn't said a single word since that day. Edit. People have asked me for news coverage of this event. This story happened during the opening years of the war on drugs in northwestern Mexico, a time where both the government and the drug lords, they are usually the same people, by the way, did everything within their power to keep news like this from being published. I will try to find some and ask my co-worker, but I can't promise anything. Pick your battles a little more carefully. Originally posted in Petty Revenge, was recommended that I post it in Nuclear Revenge. Here's the obligatory intro paragraph. On mobile, long time lurker, first post. Long wind up, revenge at the end. So basically, I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment 2 months ago, with Sarah and Jessica, names changed. Now, Sarah is on the lease, Jessica is Sarah's girlfriend, and isn't on the lease. I pay 50%, Sarah pays 25% and Jessica pays 25% of rent. Not my ideal situation, but I was desperate for roommates at the time. Fast forward 2 months, they're enormous slobs who never do anything, so I clean up after them all the time. I vacuum the living room, mop the kitchen, do dishes, etc. I buy most of the shared groceries and household items like TP, which the 2 of them plow through really quickly. Sarah has a cat in the apartment which is unauthorized, and regularly has an unauthorized dog here too. Their rent is paid late and utilities on the last possible day. Also, the girls smoke copious amounts of weed, and while I don't care, I ask them to be respectful enough to air out the apartment and keep the smoke out of my room. Now, last week shit goes south. Sarah and Jessica overheard me bitching about having to clean up after them, and after ignoring me for a few days, sent me a long text about how rude they considered that, etc. So I'll let out everything that was bothering me, and tell them that, if they don't want to live with me, I'll gladly release them from the lease, repay the deposit, and they can go. This causes them to freak out, and they tell me, it's 2 against 1, we will force you to move. Oh hell no. I blocked them on all forms of social media and means of communication. The next day, I went down to the apartment managers and reported the 2 unauthorized pets and the unauthorized occupant. Written notices were given. Sarah and Jessica threw them straight in the trash. I returned from a 4-day stay at my dad's and go straight to report the unauthorized occupant Jessica, who has already once been asked to leave, and both unauthorized pets which were supposed to be gone by now. Well, at this point Sarah and Jessica are getting pissed off. Jessica screams obscenities at me anytime I enter or leave my bedroom. Twice she spent a half-hour period pounding on my door and the walls of my room. She taunts me through the door trying to get me to open up. All of this is being quietly recorded on my phone while I still haven't said a word. So yesterday, I went back down to the office to finish securing my new apartment and to report more violations. When I came home, the chain lock was locked, so I had no way to get in. This is what I had been waiting for. Jessica taunts me again, on video, and then slaps my hat off my head, hitting me square in the forehead with the back of her hand. Bingo. The revenge. I call the cops, rat Sarah and Jessica out for being druggies, get all their paraphernalia confiscated, and get a police report for battery. Come Monday, I'll be on my way to the prosecutor's office to press charges. The apartment managers will also be getting a copy of this report. Also, tomorrow is the last day to pay rent before it's late. Sarah and Jessica disappeared early this morning. If they don't pay rent, I'm gonna get them on the abandonment clause, finally get them evicted, and have the locks change. All before I move out tomorrow. It's 2 against 1. Think again. Man shoots childhood bully at reunion. Thanapatina Kesri, 69 years old, went to a reunion event with his old classmates from Angthong. Thanapat then found his childhood bully Suthat Kasayamat, 69, at the event. Near the end of the party, a confrontation ensued. Thanapat accused Suthat of bullying him when they were 16 and demanded he apologized. Suthat refused and told him to forget it, causing a fight. Thanapat then pulled out a handgun, shot Suthat, and fled. Suthat was rushed to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Here is a picture took at the reunion. There is a link in the description to the news report. Guns, drugs and an overreaction. This took place about 9 to 10 years ago, after a work-related back injury. I was on workers' comp, and had a ton of free time and severe back pain. I decided to give marijuana a try for the first time in several years. I live in CA, and it was legal to use pot here with a doctor's recommendation. Right before all of this, I moved into a cheap little apartment in a not so great part of the city. I was naive and didn't realize that I was surrounded by meth addicts. I'm a musician, and one of my neighbors was a fellow guitarist, Tim. We bonded pretty quickly over music and smoking pot. Things were going fine with my new place until our landlord, Cindy, got into a huge blowout with Tim over their illegal weed growing operation. Those idiots were growing hundreds of plants in the empty units without any permits or the consent of the owner. I don't know what really happened between them, because the stories kept changing, but the fight was basically over money. Cindy was a woman in her 50s, but turned into a junior high school bully and set out to turn everyone against him. She first tried to get me on her side by giving me copious amounts of pot. When that didn't work, she started vandalizing my property and framed Tim for it. I became furious at him and confronted him about what was happening. We got into a huge shouting match and he called me someone who has never used a drug in her life, unless you count pot, a meth head. His insult was especially ridiculous because he was an active meth user. After that incident, Tim would bang on my front door at all hours of the night, would yell racist slurs and insults at me, and even tried to kick my puppy. The final straw was when he ran up to me while I was outside and threw a huge bucket of hot water on me, my puppy and my fucking phone. My dog was fine, and after placing my phone in a bag of uncooked rice, it was fine too. I, on the other hand, was beyond livid. The revenge. I talked to a friend, Chris, about what was going on at my place and we concocted a plan. Since Cindy wanted me on her side, she gave me lots of information about Tim, including his cell number, which I gave to Chris. He started calling Tim several times a day. Chris also started parking his car in visible places near the apartment complex. I began talking to the other neighbors and fed them information about mysterious cars and people watching the apartment complex. I knew the info would get back to Tim without me having to do very much. Tim became more and more paranoid and got to the point that he finally asked me, of all people, if I had noticed anything strange. I told him I had been seeing a strange car nearby with people just watching his apartment. He tried to give a half-ass apology and asked me to let him know if I saw anything else. As a good neighbor, of course I agreed. He said he didn't know if it was the cops or a gang following and watching him. I shrugged as if I didn't know. After about 2 weeks of Chris volunteering his free time to help me with my revenge, it all came to a head. One day, Tim hopped into his car and started driving. I was on the phone with Chris as he gave me the play-by-play. Tim tried to lose Chris by turning into a grocery store parking lot down the street. Chris jumped out of his car and fired a gun into the air several times and all hell broke loose. I had no idea he even carried a gun. Chris then chased him a few miles down the road until I was finally able to get him to stop and go home. I was worried he'd be arrested, so I called everything off, but it didn't matter at that point. Tim was now convinced that they were trying to kill him or somehow steal his pot growing operation. A couple of days later, Cindy asked if I was interested in moving into Tim's apartment, which was slightly bigger than mine. I asked what was going on, and she told me that Tim was moving out of state and that she was getting rid of their growing operation ASAP. By this time, I found out that she had been responsible for starting the fight between Tim and I was already looking for another place to live, so I declined and instead found the phone numbers for the complex owner and his son. I told them everything about the grow rooms. I also called the power company to let them know about the illegal power usage for the empty units. I'm not sure what happened with the power company, but when I called to inquire about an available apartment a few months later, I found out that the new landlord was one of my old neighbors. Cindy still lived in the complex, but was no longer in charge. I settled my workers' comp case a few weeks later and moved on. Although this was a very turbulent but short time in my life, it taught me many valuable lessons. An Australian pilot enacts revenge against the Germans in World War II. Bit of backstory. Clive Caldwell, Australian pilot. He wound up in a British RAF squadron, flying a P-40 Tomahawk. One of the first units in the world to fly one. Clive had trouble mastering the skill of gunnery deflection. He developed a training technique known as shadow shooting. You shoot at the shadow of your own aircraft. This was later adopted by the Desert Air Force. Now, onto the revenge. On July 4, 1941, Clive watched a German pilot kill his close friend, Donald Munro, as he was parachuting to the ground. This harshened Clive's attitude, and he ended up shooting every parachuting enemy pilot he could. This earned him the nickname Clive Killer Caldwell. Clive shot down 28.5 aircraft, and had an ace in a day. He nearly killed one of Germany's most famous aces, Lieutenant Werner Skrauer. Edit made it seem like he was rewarded for the act. He was not. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for daily revenge stories.